Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. It's at 11 right now, and we'll give it just another minute or two before we get started to allow for more folks to join in. If you are unable to join through the audio on your computer, please know that you can call in as well. I sent that information through the chat. The chat box is also where we will be taking questions. So feel free to send us any questions or any comments through the webinar, throughout the webinar in the chat feature. Otherwise, we'll get started in just a second here. Thank you. All right, we're ready to get started on our end. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sana Megani, and I am a program manager here at Trellis Company. We are so excited to have you all join us today for this webinar. Just some housekeeping items. Again, if you weren't on earlier and you need to join audio through your cell phone or your phone, you can call in. I sent that information in the chat box. The chat box is also where we will be taking questions for today's webinar. So feel free to chat us any questions you have or any comments you have through the webinar, and we will do our best to answer everyone's questions. If we were unable to get to you, then the presenters for today will follow up with you directly as well. So with that, I would like to introduce our presenters for today. I am really excited to introduce Richard Sapp. He is a college access and community engagement consultant here at Trellis. He leads our efforts in pre-college outreach and college awareness. Richard helps secondary and post-secondary institutions provide information to families so that they make informed decisions on higher education and the options available to them. We also have a guest speaker here from Texas Women's University, Brandy Gillum. She is a financial aid counselor there. Brandy has been working at TWU since 2005, and she has processed over 4,000 TAFSA applications since 2012. She enjoys working with students and helping them achieve their educational dreams. She is married with 5 children and 1 amazing granddaughter. Thank you so much, Brandy, for being here with us as well. And I want to be sure that we know she's here, but here we go. Brandy, can you hear us? Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning.
Great. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Richard and Brandy, and we'll take it from there. Thanks, y'all.
Again, hello, and thank you so much for joining us. We're super excited to be here to provide some information to you on completing the TASFA, the Texas Application for State Financial Aid. The Texas Application for State Financial Aid is used to collect information to help determine eligibility for state financial aid programs that are administered by institutions of higher education in the state of Texas. Students that are classified as Texas residents who cannot apply for federal financial aid using the FAFSA, or the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, are encouraged to complete the TASFA. A student completing the FAFSA should not complete the TASFA. For purposes of this webinar, we will assume the students are not federal aid eligible. So no student should complete both applications. Those not eligible for federal aid will complete the TASFA in the state of Texas. For today's webinar, we will help you gain an understanding about completing the TASFA, discuss answers to frequently asked questions. Throughout the presentation, we'll have questions. We have questions embedded, and so we'll give you a few moments to answer those, and then we'll discuss the answers to those questions. And then we'll discover resources to help your students complete the TASFA. The TASFA came about by HB 1403, which was passed in 2001 by the state legislature. It was later updated to Senate Bill 1528. This law classifies eligible students as Texas residents for purposes of paying tuition. Those eligible as state residents are eligible for state financial aid at Texas colleges and universities. And by the way, the use of the term resident for this presentation purposes is for college admissions, tuition purposes, and not a legal status or legal term. So the requirements for in-state tuition are: students must have graduated from a Texas high school or receive their GED in Texas. They have to reside in Texas for at least 3 consecutive years before graduation from high school or receiving the GED. They must reside in Texas for at least 1 year leading up to college enrollment. And certain students will have to sign a notarized affidavit of intent, which would happen during the admissions process. The affidavit of intent states that the student will apply for legal or permanent status as soon as they are able to. Again, this would happen during the admissions process. So we're going to have a couple of scenarios that I'll have Brandy read, and then you provide the answers, and then we'll discuss the answers to those. So go ahead, Brandy.
So this is concerning our student Maria. My family and I came to Laredo, Texas from Monterrey, Mexico when I was 8 years old. I went to school in Laredo until the end of the 9th grade. We then moved to Austin, Texas, where I started the 10th grade. I will graduate in May of 2020. Will I qualify for in-state tuition?
And I'll give you a few seconds to do the type in your answer. Obviously, we have a very intelligent listening audience across the board. Everyone has answered the question correctly. The answer is yes, she will qualify. She'll qualify because she's lived here prior to the 3 years before graduation. The fact that she moved from Laredo, Texas to Austin, Texas wouldn't matter as long as she's in the state of Texas. Scenario number 2.
This is regarding our student Ricardo. I have lived in Texas since April of 2017. I was in an accelerated program and I graduated high school early June of 2019. Do I qualify for in-state tuition?
We have a combination of answers. And so it looks like someone said that that's a hard one, but let's explain that one. Unfortunately, Ricardo will not qualify for in-state tuition. Ricardo lived in the state for only 2 years before graduation. And thus, once he graduated after 2 years, he became ineligible for, as the legislation is currently written, ineligible for in-state tuition. What's important to note, and I loaded this question with some things, is that he's in an accelerated program, which means that he probably graduated early. Had he graduated in 3 years as opposed to 2 years, he would have qualified. But once he graduated, there's no resetting of the clock, and unfortunately, he would not be eligible for in-state tuition. Scenario number 3.
This is in reference to our student Jacob. I came from Jamaica to the United States. I have lived in Texas since I was 5 years old. I graduated high school in June of 2018. Beginning summer of 2018, I went to live with my aunt in Florida to save money for college. I returned to Texas after a year to start college in fall of 2019. Do I qualify for in-state tuition?
Very smart listening audience. The correct answer is no. Jacob does not qualify for in-state tuition. Jacob met the 3-year living in Texas threshold before graduating, but when he left for a year to move to Florida, he broke his residency, and unfortunately in the fall of 2019, he would not qualify for in-state tuition. However, unlike the previous scenario, Jacob can reestablish domicile, come back for a year, and then become eligible for in-state tuition. So yes, he does not qualify, but in fall 2020, he would qualify because he would be able to reestablish domicile by returning and living in the state for 1 year. So just the TASFA timeline for 2021, which is very similar to the FAFSA timeline. So beginning in September, and that would be the fall of the senior year, the students would apply for admissions. If required, they would fulfill the residency requirement of completing the notarized affidavit of intent. Males must register with Selective Service. We'll discuss that a bit more later. And then beginning in October, as a matter of fact, on October the 1st, students can begin completing the TASFA. That application is available, much like the FAFSA, on October the 1st of each year. The students would complete the TASFA, make copies of the TASFA, use an original signature, and then mail the TASFAs directly to the college's financial aid office. That would be the colleges that the student is considering attending. We do encourage students to mail, to not just send a TASFA to one institution. I like to think that if a student has applied for admissions, they are interested in attending, and they should mail the TASFA applying and hoping to get financial aid to those institutions. And then students should follow up with the college that they're deciding to attend. So here's a list of some state aid programs for which TASFA applicants may be eligible for. You see the Texas Grant, which is the largest and probably the most popular of all the state financial aid programs. There's several more, but I want to call your attention to the Texas College Work Study Program. Those students that are eligible or allowed to work and have a work permit may qualify for Texas College Work Study. Obviously, much like the federal work study, they'd have to apply for the job on the campus, filling out an application. It works the same way. Not all colleges participate in the Texas College Work Study Program, but those students that are eligible to work may possibly get a Texas College Work Study job. So we know these students have limited options. Federal aid is not going to be available. These students can qualify, or they can possibly apply for a college access loan. However, they must have a cosigner, and the cosigner must be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. The student status will not be considered, but the cosigner must be a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. And then lastly, we encourage all students to apply for scholarships. Sometimes scholarships may have a FAFSA requirement, but sometimes the scholarship, the student just has to demonstrate a financial need. The TASFA does calculate the student's expected family contribution, and thus they're able to demonstrate a financial need. Sometimes the scholarships may require a Social Security number. Some of these students will have Social Security numbers, but the key is for those students to ask questions, and U.S. service providers and those that are helping these students ask questions of the scholarship providers. Questions like, if they're requiring a FAFSA, is it simply because the student needs to demonstrate a financial need by showing the EFC, and then make them realize that the TASFA does show the expected family contribution also. So we encourage students to apply, and obviously they apply early and be very rigorous, much like any student in applying for scholarships. And now I'd like to turn it over to Brandy to talk about the application process, but I wanted to mention a couple of things. The FAFSA application is used for both new students and returning students, and sometimes there are questions that may not necessarily make sense for the new student, or sometimes it may just be for the returning student. Students should answer each question. If the question is not applicable to a student, they should check the NA box or write NA. This simply helps the financial aid administrator understand that the student didn't miss the question, but it's not applicable. Sometimes a student will skip the question if it's not applicable, but we can help the administrators out by letting them know that the question wasn't skipped. It simply didn't apply to them. And now I'll turn it over to Brandy to discuss the actual application.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for joining us today. So I just want to go over some things that we'll be learning about the TASFA regarding Section 1 is the student information, Section 2, the student dependency status determination, Section 3, the parent information, Section 4, the income information, the student and parent, Section 5, the household information, and Section 6, the signature page. So this begins the top of the TASFA application. The Texas application for state financial aid, the TASFA collects information to help determine eligibility for state or institutional financial aid programs administered by institutions of higher education in the state of Texas. Students classified as Texas residents are not eligible to apply for federal financial aid using the free application for FAFSA student aid, the FAFSA, are encouraged to complete the TASFA. A couple of things I want to point out. The Texas state priority deadline for many institutions, including our school at TWU of higher education, is January 15, 2020 for the 2021 school year. It is recommended that applicants complete and submit this application and any other required documentation to the financial aid office on or before January 15th. That would be the priority deadline. Texas residency and final eligibility for financial aid can only be determined by the institution that you plan to attend. We're going to go into actually section 1, the student information. So basically they would begin by filling in their last name, their first name. If they do have an actual social security number, not a social security number to file taxes, but an actual social security number, they can put it in there. If they do not, they just check the box NA. Kind of skipping down to number 13, what high school completion status will you will be when you begin college in the 2021 school year? What will your status be? Will you have a high school diploma? Will you be homeschooled or a GED? Have them fill in what high school name and the city and date of graduation that they will be attaining their high school diploma and GED. Going into the section 1. Number 21, where do you plan to live during the 2021 school year? Will they be living on campus, off campus, or with their parent? How many hours do you plan on attending per semester? This actually helps set up their cost of attendance. At TWU, the minimum requirements to apply for a Texas Public Education grant is to enroll in at least 6 hours, which is considered half-time. However, if they're trying to apply for the Toward Excellence grant, they need to enroll in at least 9 or more hours and complete 24 credit hours within an academic school year. Down to 24, were you born male or female? This question is what they were established on their birth certificate at birth. Were you born a male or female? Skipping over to number 27, are you interested in being considered for the Texas College Work Study Program? And if so, do you have your authorization to work in the U.S., meaning do you have your DACA? And what is their marital status? And what is the month and year that the student was married, remarried, separated, divorced? Going into section 1, the student information. This is for our male students. All male students are required to register for selective service unless they're under the age of 18 at the time that they turn in their TASFA application. They can check the appropriate box whether they're registered. They can also go to the website sss.gov and if they are registered, and download their selective service registration and get that to the schools. Or if they're exempt, they can check the appropriate box if they're exempt. And if they're female, they can just skip this section.
I apologize, Brandy. Let me join in 1 second. We had a little difficulty, and I advanced the slide a couple of slides ahead of time. Again, I apologize to you, Brandy, and those listening too. Earlier, I mentioned that sometimes that this application is for both new and returning students, and this was put there to help those returning students that have already submitted it. They'll let the institution know that they've already submitted it. A couple of other things and sometimes we get these questions by male student, and I think Brandy said it would be that gender that was assigned at birth, despite the fact that the student may be different now than what was assigned at birth. They have to do it if they were a male assigned at birth. Additionally, one of the things is we want students to go ahead and submit the TASFA and not wait on getting their selective service information, and so they let the institution know, but they must realize that they'll have to submit that before they're offered aid. The student, Brandy mentioned, the student can go to sss.gov. If they have a social security number, they'll be able to apply for that there. If not, they can print the application, but they'll have to mail that in. But again, the student must provide that proof to the institution prior to them being able to receive some aid. Also note at the very last, it says I'm over the age of 18, I'm not registered with selective service, and I am not exempt from registration with selective service. Just realize that students must register with selective service if they're over 18 and gender assigned as male at birth, or they will not be able to receive federal financial aid. And so by checking that box, they're basically saying if they're not going to register, then they have to understand that they're not going to receive state aid. Just wanted to provide some clarification to that. Go ahead, Brandy.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, now we're going into section 2. This determines the dependency or independent status of the student. So going down to, they would need to check yes or no to the appropriate box. Going from, were you born before January 1st, 1997? Are you married? You would check either yes or no. Now, I want to pay close attention to questions 34 through 40. If they do mark yes in any of these boxes, they may or may not need to provide documentation as to that college as to why they checked yes. They may need to submit to determine, you know, what their status is. For example, let's pay close attention to number 39. If the student was homeless, that institution may want some type of documentation from like a high school or homeless shelter to prove that that is their situation. Number 37, as determined by the state courts, is someone other than your parents, step-parent, or legal guardian have legal guardianship over you. If they do check yes, they may need to provide the court documentation needed to prove that they are in legal guardianship or that they are in legal guardianship with their parents. Okay. Going on to section 3. All right, so this is for the parents' information. They would need to answer these questions as to number 41, as of today, what is the parent's marital status? Let's pay close attention to where it says unmarried and both parents living together. This would have to do if the student's parents are the biological parents, that they're not married, but they're living together, then they do need to list both their mother and their father on the TASFA application, even though they're not married. If the student's mother is living with their mother and stepfather or vice versa, they need to list that step-parent information on the TASFA. Number 49, this is important to some colleges, the highest level of the parent's education completed, because some colleges do or may have a first-generation scholarship that they can be referred to. And if that college does, this would be a good thing to note on the TASFA of the parent's highest level of education completed. Right, going into section 4. All right, so this has to do with the earnings of the student and the parents. Did you or your spouse work in 2018? And remember, we are in a prior year. So for the 2021 TASFA, if they marked that they did work and or they did file taxes, then they will need to turn in a copy of their 2018 signed tax return, or they may need to turn in a copy of their tax transcripts. It depends on the school that they go to. Here at TWU, they can go ahead and turn in their 2018 tax returns as long as it's signed. Some students may or may not be selected to be verified, which we can go into if you have questions in a little while. If they are selected to be verified, they do need to turn in a copy of their tax transcript, which they can get online at www.irs.gov. Going into 61, as of today, are you or a spouse a dislocated worker, currently unemployed? In other words, have they lost their job within the past 3 months? Going into parent earnings, same situation. Did you or your parents work in 2018? If they did work and they did file, they do need to turn in a copy of their 2018 tax return signed or their 2018 IRS tax transcript. If the parents did work but they didn't file, then they do need to go ahead and provide the income documentation, which could be in a form of a W-2. Or if they did work and get paid cash, they may need to provide a letter stating how much they were paid in cash.
Brandy, what determines whether or not a student or their parents would file taxes?
Well, that's a good question. Let's go on to the next screen. right here, we have the filing threshold. So this is for 2018 income threshold. So for example, if the student is single, under the age of 65, and they file and they made at least 12,000 for the year, then they would need to, by the IRS guidelines, they are required to file a tax return. If they made under 12,000 for the year, they're under 65 and single, the student or the parent, then they don't have to file a tax return. But if the student or the parent is married and they're filing jointly and they are under the age of 65 and they made over 24,000 or over, they are required to file a tax return. If they made under 24,000 for the year, then they're not required. Now, if we do have a student that turns in a TASFA and they mark on the TASFA that they didn't file, but they did make 24,000 or up, we will still take the TASFA application. However, we cannot complete the TASFA unless they do turn in a copy of the 2018 tax returns for that year. Okay, going into step 4, the income information. Basically, this is just additional information needed in order to proceed with the TASFA. Going into number 67, there's a section for each of the student and or their spouse, parent 1 and or parent 2. And so number 67 says, do they receive any child support for any of your children? So of course, if the student has a child and they get child support, they would mark it in there. If it doesn't apply, please have your students mark either 0 or NA, and have them not leave it blank. They would need to actually physically put something in there, either 0 or the amount or NA. Going on down to, do they pay child support? They would need to put in the appropriate amount in the boxes. And then 76, 77, and 78. Number 76, as of today, what is your total current balance of cash, savings, and checking accounts? It's what it is the day that they turn in the TASFA application, or mail it, fax it, or email it. Depends on what they want to do to that school. Number 77, what is your net worth of investments, including all real estate? Now, the number one mistake that I do see is sometimes students put in here the amount of their actual house that they live in. That is, just tell them it's if your parents have any rental houses, not the house that they actually physically live in. Number 78, and what is your net worth current business? Some students' parents do own a business. They just want to know what is the current net worth if they were to sell their business. Going into section 5, the household information. Oh, I apologize. Step 4, income information. All right, so if the student or the student's parents are receiving any of these government programs, whether it's Medicaid, SNAP, formerly known as the food stamp program, if they're receiving any type of free or reduced lunch program, TANF, which is another form of needs for monies for children, or special supplemental nutrition program, also known as WIC, then they can check the appropriate box. If not, they do need to go ahead and check NA if it doesn't apply to them. And the school may or may not need documentation, and it's up to that school as to if they did check one of these programs.
Also, one thing to note is, unlike most questions, this is for 2018 and 2019, as opposed to some of the tax questions. This is just for the tax year. So this is a 2-year question, 2018 and 2019.
Okay, and then the step 5 is the household information. So this particular form is where the student would list everyone in their household. If they're independent, it would be who would they would be supporting using more than 50% of their income. They would list themselves and or any children that they do take care of. If it's their parents, they would list if they're living with their parents, they would list their parents and the student. and anyone else that they are, supporting more than 50% of their income. Now, if by chance that they have roommates and their roommates are living there, or if their grandparents are living there and they are contributing to the household and paying rent, they would not list the roommates or the grandparents. However, if they are supporting those people in their house, then they can list them there, but they may have to provide documentation. It's up to the school.
The last section is section 6, which requires the signatures. The student will sign and date, and if the student was required to provide parental information, one of the parents will sign and date. The student must also indicate whether it's parent 1 or parent 2. As we said earlier, the student should complete the TASFA, make copies, and then have the student and the parent make original signatures. And so don't complete it, sign it, and then make copies. Complete it, make copies, and then send original or wet signatures to each of the institutions that the student is considering attending. And of course, if they're required to send additional documentation, make copies of the documentation and send with the TASFA.
And I also want to add, if the student's parents are unable to sign the TASFA if they're in another country, please encourage to go ahead and have your students send the TASFA over and contact that institution, and they can work with the institution on the requirements needed, or they can work with the student on what is needed in order to help them complete the TASFA.
Also note that with the TASFA comes some sets of instructions, and so if you're working on a question and you're not quite sure how to answer it, take a look at the instructions that may help you answer that. I didn't mention earlier, but the TASFA is also available. The TASFA and the instructions is available in English and in Spanish. They're available now, and they're available each year on October the 1st. Just a few more things is just going over the timeline and completing the TASFA. The student applies for admissions, confirms eligibility for state aid. That happens during the admissions process with the admissions office or the registrar's office, particularly if they're applying via Apply Texas. If required, they may have to do a notarized affidavit of intent. Males must register with Selective Service. We encourage males to register with Selective Service, but check on the TASFA if they've registered, and then that they'll send the information later, but don't wait until you get the confirmation from Selective Service. Go ahead and send the TASFA and send that confirmation once you receive it. Obviously, you confirm the college accepts the TASFA. If they don't accept the TASFA, they're probably going to accept a paper FAFSA. Some colleges will accept the TASFA or the FAFSA. They may have a preference for one or the other, but generally most will accept the TASFA. If not, a paper FAFSA, sometimes both. Confirm the tax filing threshold. If that threshold was met, then taxes must be filed. Inquire with the colleges. Various colleges require, the requirements are different. Some want just the TASFA. Some want the TASFA and additional information. Some will say send the TASFA. We'll contact you if we need additional information. That may be proof of income, IRS tax returns, W-2s, or tax transcript. Maybe an explanation of how you met living expenses, or letters of support of your current situation. Complete, make copies, sign and mail the TASFA, copies of the other required documents. I like to tell students that can do this to send registered mail or certified mail. The reason why I like students to do that is it takes the anxiety out of knowing whether or not the institution received the TASFA. So basically, it's a lot of times students will mail it, but they're not certain, and they're just worried about a lot of different things. We know students that are seniors and applying have a lot of different things going on. This just relieves one bit of anxiety by sending it registered mail or certified mail. Follow up with the college in 2 to 4 weeks to see if anything else is needed. Obviously, you're following up if you didn't send it registered mail or certified mail to see if they received it, but also what additional documentation is needed, and then what the college's process is and what their timeline will be.
So Richard, let's go in just a little bit. What is the affidavit, Richard?
The affidavit, students may be selected to do an affidavit. The affidavit basically states that the student will apply for a legal status as soon as they're able to apply for that status. And that must be done yearly.
Thank you.
The next slide was the TASFA notes that I mentioned earlier. Again, that's going to be available in English and in Spanish. And so anytime you have a question, if you can't reach out to the school, it's not quite clear, turn to the notes section and hopefully they can give a further detailed explanation of what is needed. So we have a few more questions that we'd like to ask, and I'll ask Brandy to read those, and then we'll give you a couple moments, and then we'll provide an answer or an explanation for the questions.
Thank you, Richard. So here's question number 1. If my parents don't file taxes and they get paid in cash, how do I report their income on the TASFA?
And I actually see a couple of questions that are really that we got, and I'm sorry I didn't get to those right away, but we'll answer those, and we'll answer those while we answer this question. So if they don't file taxes, on question number 63 is where the parents will put their income. So if they got paid in cash, they ask for cash, wages, salaries, or tips, it's question number 63 for parents. And for students, it's question number 58.
Thank you.
Next question.
Do my parents or I need to file taxes if neither of us has a Social Security number?
I think we discussed this one earlier, and the audience has shown that they're very smart and they understand. We talked about this before. Whether or not a person has a Social Security number isn't a factor in filing taxes. What's a factor is if they met the IRS threshold for filing taxes. And so basically we showed that slide that we got from irs.gov of 2018 tax filing thresholds. That will drive or determine if a student or parents will need to file taxes. If they met the threshold, they're required to. And I think Brandy said earlier, they'll go ahead and receive the TASFA, but they won't be able to distribute aid, award aid, until the taxes are filed and they receive verification of such. So we'll go on to question number 3.
I support my family and have filed as head of household on my taxes. My parents do not work. Do I use my tax return to complete the TASFA?
I think I'm getting some responses. Overwhelmingly, yes, the response, and this is a student. The student would use their tax return to complete the TASFA. If the student wasn't able to answer any of the questions in the dependency, answer yes to any of the questions in the dependency section, then he or she will need their parental information, but since they weren't working, then they would put 0 in that space where it asks the amount that their parents made. Again, remember, this was mentioned earlier, make sure that you're not skipping questions, make sure you're answering, and if the answer is 0, then you put 0, or if it's not applicable, you put NA, but all questions must be answered. It simply helps the aid administrators know that you didn't miss a question. So for this particular one, the student would use their information. For their parents, they would use 0 since they didn't work, and then they would submit the TASFA. Number 4.
One of my parents lives out of the country. Whose income do I report on the TASFA?
I see that we're getting several questions, and we're going to go through some of those questions. And so just in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and answer these questions. We've got a few more, and then we'll get to some of the questions that the audience has asked. For this particular question, it kind of depends. If the parent that lives out of the country, if they're divorced or separated, then they're not going to use that parent's income. They're just use the parent who lives in the country. But if they're not divorced or separated, that parent just happens to work out of the country, then they're going to use that income. You may have to do some type of calculation. You may also have to send a letter. It's very possible that that parent filed a tax return, a foreign tax return, or U.S. income tax return, You're going to have to submit that possibly in the process later on. Connect with the institution to see what you'll do. But yeah, depending on the situation, if they're divorced or separated, then you don't use their parents' information. If they're not, they just happen to be working out of the country, you would use their income on the TASFA. Next question.
Question 5, what if my father worked in 2018 but was laid off this year and hasn't found work? Do I still report his 2018 income?
Again, for interest of time, we'll answer these questions. But yes, the student would report their father's income for 2018. However, the student is encouraged to make an appointment with the financial aid office at the institution he or she is considering attending and ask them what's the next steps. They'll probably want supporting documentation of what's going on, or information that says that their father was laid off, hasn't found work, or maybe if the father, even if he found new work, they'll want that information. It's important to remember that, obviously the TASFA with prior, they're looking at 1 year and trying to determine what can be paid 3 years. Sometimes situations change, especially loss of income. But if something happens, you have to use that year's income, but then make an appointment with the financial aid office. They'll probably want supporting documentation of that situation so that they can possibly make adjustments to the financial aid package.
That is true. That's called a special circumstance. So each school can determine they would need to provide the documentation at that school. Going into the 2021 school year, they would need to turn in at that time, when it's ready, the 2019 tax information. They may need to turn in W-2s. They might need to get a letter from that employer stating that they were their last day of employment, etc., but they can work with that school. All right, going into question 6, once the TASFA is complete, what do I do with the application?
Correct. The TASFA should be mailed to the institutions that the student is attending or hoping to attend. Again, we encourage students to not just do one TASFA to one institution, but send it to multiple institutions and mail it to the financial aid office at the campus that he or she is considering attending.
Going into question 7, if I have questions once I start filling out the TASFA, where can I call?
The first place would be the financial aid office at the institution the student is considering. But we also have another number to call, and we'll go into that as we go into resources. So a few resources. Trellis Company has a website called AIE.org, adventuresin.education.org, or AIE.org. Here you can download the application and instructions, both the English and Spanish. You can also watch a TASFA video that's available in English and Spanish. We are about 2 or 3 days from putting up the current 2020, 2021 TASFA. And we encourage you to take a look at that. Those that are working at institutions, you can actually put a link on your page to those videos. So the collegeforalltexans.com is a website for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. There's a lot of financial aid and information there, and we encourage you to go to College for All Texans to get that information also. And lastly, the Texas Financial Aid Information Center is a call center of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. This call center can provide information to students and families on a various information. It offers year-round support of issues related to student financial aid. The center serves as a one-stop resource for schools, students, and families who have questions about financial aid eligibility, the application process, state financial aid programs, education-related tax benefits, and more. Texas Financial Aid Information Center is a great resource for not only students and families, but also for counselors. And now we'll get into some of the questions that we received earlier.
All right. So thank you all for your participation today. And here we go. We have a question from Fred Pena. Should parents be required to apply for the ITIN in order to file their taxes if they meet the IRS income?
Yes, and that's the way to do it. You do through a W-7, you apply for an individual taxpayer identification number, and that is the way to file taxes for those that do not have a Social Security number. Great question.
Our next question is from Jonathan Rodriguez, and his question is, if a student's parent earned enough income during 2018 to be required to file taxes based on IRS law, but chose not to file due to fear of deportation, does this make the student ineligible?
It doesn't make the student ineligible, but if the student indicated that their parents did make above the IRS threshold, the financial aid office will not be able to award aid unless the student can show verification that the parents did file taxes.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that question. Our next question is from Erica, and the question is, if parents don't have a social, do they need to do income or non-filing letter?
I'm going to let Brandy field that from the school's perspective.
So if the student or parent doesn't have a social and they reported on the TASFA application that they made or exceeded the IRS threshold, they can go ahead and obtain a Social Security number for tax filing purposes. They can work with any tax accountant, or they can file with that document online to apply for a Social Security number to file taxes. But if they didn't make or the amount or above the threshold and they did not file taxes, we can still take the TASFA. We just wouldn't be able to complete it without their 2018 tax information.
So that's almost the same scenario. You would get an individual taxpayer identification number and file your taxes. So that was really almost like the same question. I think you do that. And more information is irs.gov. But obtaining through a W-7, you file for the I-10. And many parents and many students do that when they make over the threshold.
All right, our next question is, what are examples of reasons a male student could be exempt from registering for selective service if they're between the age of 18 to 26 for F1 visa?
I'm not up to speed on that. That would be something that I would have to research, but I can certainly get back to you. I see that I guess I don't have a contact information, but I'm just not familiar with the visas. I just know of the requirements. I'm not familiar with the exemptions. Oftentimes students don't, sometimes I've known some students, or I've heard of some students that have physical limitations, which would make them not able to serve, but sometimes even those students will still register so that they can make that aid available, even though their physical limitations, blind students, deaf students, or students that have certain physical liabilities may not be able to, but they can certainly register.
If that was your question and you would want to follow up more with Richard, please send us a private chat message with your contact information and we'll follow up with you. Our next question is, this one right here. We just received a TASFA yesterday from a student. They are pending a green card, graduated from a Texas high school, been there since a freshman, but they do not have a social or DACA. We're trying to figure out what number he has given us, but admissions has classified him as an international student. Is he considered an international student?
That would determine from the school. Actually, they would need to work with their school. They can, submit that affidavit. Again, the affidavit would, basically states that they are trying to get their permanent residency while they're in school. It doesn't mean that they're required, but they're trying to get, to turn in that documentation. Now you can, whether they have or they do not have their DACA and they meet the eligibility requirements of the TASFA, they can still turn in that TASFA application.
All right. Okay, Elizabeth, great question. Can I get a copy of this presentation? We will be emailing you a recording with the PowerPoint presentation within the next week. So please be on the lookout for that email. It'll come directly from me. My name is Senna, and we'll send that out as soon as we have that ready and posted on our website. And great, thanks. Let me check one more time to make sure we haven't missed anything. All right. Well, thanks so much, y'all, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time, probably from your lunch break, to join us this afternoon. Thank you for all the great work that you do with your students. If you have any questions or concerns, I will include Richard Sapp's contact information in my follow-up email, so you can contact Richard.
Yeah, and also for the person that had the question on the visa, which I wasn't able to answer, please send me your contact information. I'd like to have a discussion with you and certainly follow up to get you the answer to that.
And actually, right before we sign out, we have one more question that came in from Sheila. We'll try to get this answered. So her question is, if I was tasked with auditing our TASFA processes and procedures, what are the areas you would suggest that I audit?
I can answer that from the non-school perspective, but I would also ask Brandon to chime in. I think one of the things is that, and I've talked to 8 administrators, that they want to make it as the same or very similar to a TASFA. I would make sure that my rules or my procedures are applied across the board, making sure that all students are getting equal treatment.
So I can help you out with that as well. Some schools do, in-house select, they are required to select students to be verified. If they are selected to be verified, which another term is to audit, they would need to contact that school. Here at our school at TWU, they are required to turn in whether they're independent or dependent. It's called a dependent or independent verification worksheet. Then they would also need to turn in 2018, the IRS tax transcript, not the account transcript, but the actual IRS tax transcript and all W-2s. And then they would need to follow up with their school after they turn everything in to make sure that there's nothing else we need. And we also follow up with our students as well to make sure that they've turned in all the documentation they need to get them through that verification. We try to make it as easy as possible.
Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us. I will have the recording and presentation to you within the next business week. If you need anything else from us, let us know. We have our contact information included as well. Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.